Fake news is a modern concept. There was a time when fake news referred specifically to a website that consisted entirely of made-up news items that had no truth. But the term has evolved. And now the term fake news basically describes anything that does not mesh with one's own worldview. For example, Slurpees are bad for your health. Fake news. Or sitting straight in my chair will prevent back pain in the future. Nah, fake news. Or if I don't clean my teeth, I'll get holes in them. Fake news. Or finally, tariffs are a tax on your own country. Hard fake news. This isn't an issue that I had growing up pre-internet, but it's definitely a one that my kids face. What is real and what is false, the lines are significantly blurred. And it's hard to know whether the article that you liked on Facebook was written by someone with knowledge and evidence or by a Russian bot. Truth in our culture is questioned. More than it has ever been. And in a postmodern culture where the question is asked, is anything even true anymore? Of course, I would argue it is, but rather that is the question of our age. This concept has taken so much of a life on its own that there are specific websites dedicated to this question. Snopes is a really good example of this. What they do is they look at things that have become viral or concepts or myths or stories and news items, and then they ask the question, is it real? And then they will say, yes, it's true, no, it's false, or someone in the middle. And I find this website really helpful, though at the moment, as you can imagine, there's a lot of American politics on there. But that's the idea. And Snopes, to make that conclusion, to arrive to say true or false, what they do is they look at the evidence. What is the evidence behind whether this stated thing happened or not? Whether it is true or whether it's false. And then we need to take that concept and apply it to the Bible. How do we know that the Bible is true or false? And we do what Snopes did, and that is we need to go to the evidence and unpack that. Today we're continuing our 4 sermon series on the Bible. The Bible is one of our values. Bible, prayer, fellowship, local outreach, global mission, and those values undergird our vision, which is, as you would all know, Christ-centered, God-dependent, spiritually growing, reaching out. And yes, that was just an opportunity for me to tell you the vision one more so that hopefully you would remember it. But that's what we're doing, 4 weeks on the Bible. And last week we did an introduction to the Bible, and today we're looking at the question, is the Bible reliable? We have a book which was written, with some parts written over 3,500 years ago. How do we know that what we have is what was originally written? I mean, we don't have any original manuscripts that the author actually wrote the Bible down. So how do we know? How do we know that it wasn't changed or even just made up altogether, as some people will argue? In a culture that is so confused about truth, how do we know the Bible is true? And we're going to look at this question specifically through the lens of the historicity and authenticity of the Bible as a historical document. And yes, I get a little Bible college lecture, but only because I kind of need to on this topic. But as a result of looking at it through this lens, there's a whole heap of stuff that I won't be able to cover. Things like the Apocrypha and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the transmission of the Bible from the original author through scribes and monks to the version and copies that we have today. But I had to pick and choose. And so if you have questions on any of those other issues, then please bring them to Bible study on Wednesday, which we are having our last Bible study of the term, and I'd love to answer some of those questions there. Okay. One day, TV talk show host and journalist Larry King was asked if he could interview anyone in history, who would it be? And Larry King said, Jesus Christ. The interviewer followed up and responded, what would you ask him? And Larry King said, I would ask him if he was indeed virgin born, because the answer to that question would define history. And while the root of that answer is in the divinity of Christ, I think it relates strongly to the question that we are asking and looking at today. For it is the Bible that says Jesus is divine. It is the Bible that says Jesus was born of a virgin. It's the Bible that describes his birth, life, death, and resurrection. It's the Bible that testifies to the divinity of Jesus Christ. And then to reframe Larry King's response, If the Bible is reliable, if what it says is actually true and trustworthy, then that changes everything. Then that defines history and defines our life as a response to it. See, the Bible is at the root of Christianity. We base our life and religion on it, as we talked about last week. It is the special revelation of God to us, where he makes his purposes, his plan, and his will known to us. But what are we basing it on? Is the Bible reliable? Okay, so what are we looking at? The Bible is the most read book in history and the first ever printed. It was actually printed first by the Gutenberg press, which was invented for the sole premise of printing the Bible, first and foremost. The Bible consists of two main languages, Hebrew, Greek, with a smattering of Aramaic. It is made of 66 books, has 49 authors, and was written over a period of 1,500 years. So just in that, it's a pretty impressive document. But we want to look at the question of its reliability. And to do so, we kind of look at two main categories: the external evidence and then the internal evidence, which is what we'll be doing today. First, in relation to the external evidence, how do we know? Now, we do not have the actual original manuscript, like that Paul or Luke wrote down, for example. That may come as a shock to you. But when you look at the bigger picture of how we have ancient documents at all, it is not that big a surprise. Now, we will be focusing today primarily on the New Testament because that's where the majority of criticism and skepticism comes in. And the first thing is that with the Bible, particularly with the New Testament, there is a comparative avalanche of early written manuscripts. One professor has noted that there is still 5,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts that still exist. And then on top of this, there are 15,000 copies of the early Latin, Syrian, and Coptic translations, amongst others. Now, this is really important. Because we have so many manuscripts, like 2,000 manuscripts, 20,000 manuscripts, it means that it gives us the ability to cross-check to see whether what one says matches up with all the others. See, we can get to a higher level of reliability if they match up. And what we've found is, for the main part of it, they do. They do match up. The other thing is, if there was a lot of errors in the copies, then we would know that those who were copying the manuscripts were making lots of mistakes. But what we find in those 20,000 early manuscripts is that for the vast majority of areas, it is the same, showing that there are very few errors, showing that what we have, therefore, is a lot more reliable. As preacher John Piper says, no other ancient book comes close to this kind of wealth of diverse preservation. In this way, what we have is pretty much what was written, and the amount of manuscripts testify to this. Okay, the next thing to note then is the gap between when the historical event occurred and when it is being written down. Okay, so in the terms of the gospel, there is about a 20-year gap between when Jesus lived and died and was resurrected, 20 to 40-year gap between when that happened and when it was actually written down, when the gospels were written down. And for us, that may seem like a very big gap. It's like me trying to write a book on the 2000 Olympics, just by memory and by stories that people have told. Like, that's a really big gap. But in that culture, at that time, in comparison to all the other ancient manuscripts, it's not that big a gap at all. Let me give you an example. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. But for information on his military conquests, scholars rely on the great historian Arrian, who wrote about it hundreds of years after the event. So, with that ancient document, 100-year gap between the event and when it was written. With the Gospels, 20 to 40 year, which is a lot less. And then there is the culture of that time, which helps us be able to trust that what we have is what actually occurred. And that is, they were really good at memorizing stuff. A little while back, when we still had the Holden Commodore, looked very much like this. I was so devastated when we got rammed up the butt and it got written off. But anyway, I at one stage needed to find the VIN number. And many of you will know I am not mechanical in any way, form or description. So rather than grabbing a torch, opening up the bonnet and trying to find the VIN number, I did what every modern non-mechanical man does, and I Googled it. See, if we want information on our world, we have the internet. We have Google and Bing and DuckDuckGo, as we looked at last week, and that provides us with the information. As a result, we don't really have to memorize anything. I mean, yeah, you do for your HSC, and it really helps if you can remember the passwords to all those shopping sites. Well, at least it did. Now you got Google, so it doesn't matter as much anymore because you got that special security thing. But it used to be you had to remember all those passwords, right? Or you had 5 and you just slightly varied them. So you put like numbers at the end and then exclamation marks. But all that to say is we don't remember stuff heaps. Like we don't need to because we have the internet. But in that culture, they memorized a lot. First of all, their information that they had access to was a lot smaller than ours. Because of our global network, because we know what's happening on the other side of the world at any given time, we have so much more information that we could know. Well, what's more is we have historical information that we can know far more than people in that culture. So they had a lot smaller amount of knowledge bank that they could learn about. The second thing is they were just really good at memorizing because that was very important to their culture. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have books, they had parchment, but not many people had access to that. And as a result, they memorized things to the point where every Jewish male in the time of the New Testament would have memorized the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Sorry, I did it out of turn, but you know what I mean. That's crazy, right? Like that's not light reading, and every Jewish male would have been expected to memorize all 5 books. And on top of that, if you wanted to be a Pharisee, then you would be expected to memorize the entirety of the Old Testament. Some Christians I know have never read the Old Testament, let alone attempted to memorize the whole thing. And yet that was the culture at that time. They were really good at memorizing things. So a gap of 20 to 40 years between when the event happened and when it was written down is nothing in that culture at that time, especially when we look at the other manuscripts. Sir Frederick Kenyon, at one time principal librarian and director of the British Museum, states, "In no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the books and the date of the earliest manuscript so short as in that of the New Testament. The books of the New Testament were written in the latter part of the 1st century. The earliest extant manuscripts are of the 4th century, say from 250 to 300 years later. This may sound like a considerable interval, but is nothing when compared to the gaps between most of the great classical authors from the earliest manuscripts." Before I said we have no original New Testament writings, nothing that literally Paul or Luke scribed themselves. But then it must be noted that we do not have that from any other ancient manuscript of that time either. And all the other texts that we do have cannot compare with the multitude of early manuscripts that we have from the Bible, from the New Testament. Okay, so then let me kind of summarize this and explain it by using an example. First, we start with the writings of Caesar, the military campaigns of Caesar. Okay, so let's have a timeline. This war is when the manuscript was first written, okay? And this gap is how long until we have the earliest manuscript. And then the amount of manuscripts will be shown or signified by the size of the balloon I have, okay? So that's when it was written. This is the earliest manuscript. And the size of the balloon is how many manuscripts we have. All right. Now, we look at the military campaigns of Caesar. They were written in about 100 to 40 BC. And the earliest copy we have is AD 900. So that is 1,000 years between when it was first written and the copy that we have. That is about 1,000 years. So let's put our thing here. We only have 10. We only have 10 manuscripts, so it's not many at all, okay? So 1,000 years there. All right, so that's not enough. We need another example. So then let's look at Aristotle. The writings of Aristotle, they were written somewhere between 384 to 322 BC. Now, the earliest copy we have is 1100 AD. So that's a 1,500-year gap. 1,500 years after it was first written to when we have. So this probably goes best as in somewhere, let's put it over here. So that's a long distance between when it was first written to the first manuscript we have. Now we have more than the writings of Caesar. We have about 50 there, so it's a little bit more, but still really small amount. So then how does the Bible compare to this? Well, when we're talking about the New Testament, specifically about the Gospels, they were written somewhere between 60 to 80 AD, and the first copy we have is 200 AD. So that means there was a difference of about 140 years to the first manuscript we have. Okay, but then how many manuscripts do we have? Well, I already said it, 20,000. So then that's the equivalent of this amount being right here. And I could go on and I've blown more balloons than possibly I have time to chuck out. But this is to show you the plethora of manuscripts that we have comparative to everything else. In terms of the reliability of the Bible, there is more evidence, so much more external evidence, that the Bible that we have is what was originally written than any other ancient manuscript by a huge margin. Yes, we can believe that the Bible is reliable. But you may say, what about the variants of the Bible? And that is an argument question that comes up. For all these manuscripts, they do sometimes disagree with each other. So how do we know which one is the right one? Well, again, because we have so many copies, we can easily cross-check them amongst each other to get to the right place. Because of all the copying done, the texts are subject to human error. And sometimes the scribes change grammar to make it sound better, or sometimes they put in a personal agenda. But again, we have so many manuscripts, they can be checked so scholars can construct the closest to what the original author had. There is strong external evidence. And then the final piece of external evidence then is archaeology. Does what the Bible say as historical fact, is it backed up by places that we have found in history through archaeology? A Jewish archaeologist, Nelson Gluck, says, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible. In fact, archaeological findings continue to back up what the scripture says. They do not deny it." So, for example, the palace where Jesus stood trial, found. The pool of Bethesda in John 5, found. They've found an inscription bearing the name of Pontius Pilate, who obviously was a big character in the crucifixion story. That is true. And an ossuary engraved with the name Joseph Caiaphas, who was the high priest of Israel, according to the Gospels. They all back up the Bible. In Luke to Acts alone, which covers a period of 70 years, we can find 16 linkages between what it says and what we know of world history. And finally, when we look at extra-biblical writings of the time, I really like this point, there are quotes from the New Testament in books that were written around that time. For example, in the Didache and the Epistle of Barnabas and Clement's letter to the Corinthians. These writings are not from the Bible, but they are still referring to the Bible. And they still include quotes, parts of the Bible in them. And they are written around 100 AD. So again, it's a huge thing to say that the Bible that we have is the Bible that was written. A huge amount of external evidence pointing to that. Okay, but then at the start I said there would be external evidence as well as internal evidence. So then let's turn to that for a second. Biopics as movies are really big at the moment. That is, you'll go to a movie that was written or produced about a certain historical character, most often in pop culture. And I want to give you two examples of these. If we can go to the next slide, Josh. Yeah, All Eyes on Me is a biopic of the life of Tupac Shakur, a 90s rapper guy. And Hugh Jackman is as the Greatest Showman. That is based on the life of circus guru P.T. Barnum. But in both of these movies, if you watch them, they have shied away from the truth of the historical figure that they are attempting to tell the story of. They don't spend much time on the flaws of these two characters. Rather, they kind of wash over them quickly and present the characters as much nicer people than what maybe they historically were. For example, in the case of Tupac Shakur, his sexual assault conviction is noted but glazed over quickly, like, shh, don't tell anyone. And P.T. Barnum, who wasn't actually the champion of tolerance and acceptance that Hugh Jackman in the movie would have you believe. P.T. Barnum was actually, in history, not a nice guy. But that's not how the movie portrays him. They're currently working on a Michael Jackson biopic, and I wonder how they're going to portray him, especially with all the allegations that have peppered his history. And by telling you this, the integrity of those movies is damaged. You can't trust that the movie is telling the truth about that historical figure because it is not telling the truth about the flaws of those figures. And yet, when we take that concept to the Bible, what we find is the Bible is very honest about the flaws of the characters in the Bible. The Bible doesn't gloss over them or polish them. The writers are honest. They deal with the issues of the apostles' failings. They included some of Jesus' harshest teachings, and they acknowledge the despair of the disciples at his death. There is no obvious attempt to hide attributes of the story that may reflect negatively on the participants. And this is the way the whole way through the Bible. Let me give you examples. Adam and Eve sinned. Cain killed. Abraham was a bigamist. Lot commits incest. Jacob deceived. Jacob deceives again. The Israelites whined. Moses got angry. Jonah ran. Samson got played. David murdered. David committed adultery. David didn't parent his children. Solomon worshipped idols. Peter denied. And then Peter denied. And then Peter denied. The apostles abandoned Christ in fear. Paul persecuted. Abraham doubted. Sarah doubted. Gideon doubted. John the Baptist doubted. Nicodemus